Okay, continue. Ooh. I can't press. So, hi everybody, and welcome to one of ADAA's webinars. And my name is Dr. Deborah Kisson. I'm the co-chair of the Public Education Committee for ADAA, and that's the Anxiety Depression Association of America. And welcome everyone to our webinar on CBT for depression, the basics. And I'm very excited to host this and to learn along with you guys. So we have a treat for us today, and I'm glad to be joining. So today we have our presenter is Dr. Rob Heinemann, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about ADAA and then also about Dr. Heinemann, who will be presenting today. So as I said, my name is Dr. Deborah Kisson. I'm the Clinical Director of Light on Anxiety Treatment Center in Chicago, also the co-chair of the Public Education Committee. And when you're done with this webinar, I encourage you to check out all the resources, well, not all of them, but some of the resources at the website, empirically supported, consumer-friendly, vetted to be top quality information. And so it's a really good place to get some of your questions answered. And these webinars are brought to you by ADAA. It's a leading nonprofit organization in the field of anxiety and depression. Our mission is to improve diagnosis and promote prevention, treatment, and the cure of anxiety, depression, and stress-related disorders through educational webinars such as this one today. So in addition, on the website, one of the great features is the Find a Therapist list. So if you're, depending on your geography, there are providers all over the world that are available, and especially these days, we've all gotten a little bit better with web-based interactions. So no one has to feel isolated that there's not support out there, because ADA and the providers associated are available to assist. And there's also a free peer-to-peer support group that you can find through ADAA.org website. And if you have any questions as you're watching this webinar, we're constantly looking out for questions from mental health consumers and posting answers. So feel free to reach out and we'll keep the conversation going. And I'm gonna now pass the presentation to Dr. Rob Heinemann, and just to give him a little background, he's a clinical psychologist at the Beck Institute in Philadelphia, where he provides therapy to clients with a wide range of presenting problems. In addition to his clinical work, Rob teaches workshops and has written book chapters and articles on topics related to cognitive therapy, depression, anxiety, personality disorders, and mindfulness. And so I'm going to stop sharing if I can find my, I think if I escape, it might be easier. Okay, stop share. Okay, and are you able to grab the power, Dr. Heinemann?
Good. I got it.
Good. Grab the power.
I love the power.
Sometimes.
Okay, so I will get going then. So thanks for having me. My name is Rob Heinemann. Again, I'm at the Beck Institute out in Philadelphia, and I'm going over the basics of depression in terms of CBT, which is cognitive behavior therapy. So what I figure I do today is I'll start just real briefly talking about diagnosing depression, and then I'm going to spend most of the time talking about what we do with CBT and depression. So I'll talk about behavioral interventions and then cognitive interventions after that. So starting off with just, what is depression? This is just based on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual in the 5th edition, or the DSM-5. So for depression to be diagnosed, you have to have at least 2 weeks of 5 of the following 9 symptoms. First off is you need at least one of these two. So depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day, which is feeling sad, empty, and hopeless. So this is what most people think of with depression is, I feel depressed. I wake up, I'm feeling sad. I'm kind of feeling despondent, hopeless, and just nothing seems to be worthwhile. You also have diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. So this is that piece of depression where, if you've talked to someone with depression or felt depressed, you just don't feel like doing anything. When you think about what to do for the day's activities, let's say like go and do something social if you have that ability. You might just think, well, what's the point of doing that? Because I'm not going to enjoy it at all. I'm not it doesn't seem like something that's worthwhile. For other symptoms, you have changes in weight, can be either weight loss or weight gain. With that is either a decrease or increase in appetite. You have difficulty sleeping, which again can kind of be on both sides, where you either have insomnia and you have trouble sleeping and you're sleeping less, or it could be oversleeping or hypersomnia. You can have differences in kind of like movement or agitation. So some people feel really slowed down. They're moving at slower paces versus others. It's more kind of like an agitation, feeling more sped up. Then you have fatigue or loss of energy. So one of my depressed clients said, every day it feels like I'm wearing like a backpack with bricks in it. I've had another client describe depression as those like wearing one of those capes that they put on you in the dentist office when you're getting an x-ray. It's just like they constantly have one of those on them. They're feeling so weighed down. You also have feeling worthless or experiencing guilt when there's no reason to. There's difficulty concentrating or making decisions, and then recurring thoughts about death or suicide. So again, of those 9 symptoms, you need one of those first 2, and then also to have 5 of these 9. And again, it has to be for at least 2 weeks of a period of time. And then within those 2 weeks happens at least more days than not. So just kind of a brief overview of depression. Now, in terms of what causes depression. Yeah, go for it.
Questions. I'm just thinking of different questions that we get from potential clients or just mental health consumers in terms of what if you don't meet full criteria? What if you have some of these symptoms, and does it even necessarily matter? Why does it matter to fully have the diagnosis of depression?
I mean, I have a little bit of a different view of this than I think a lot of therapists, but the way I describe really any kind of mental health condition is everything's normal human experience on a continuum. So there's really no like direct way to say, here's this one line that says you have it versus you don't. And if you're like just a little bit on this side, you don't versus this side. So I like to say, feeling a sense of sadness is just typical human experience. Everyone feels sadness at times. But on that continuum of sadness, if it's getting to the extent where it's either really intense or it's frequent to the point of either causing yourself distress or negatively impacting your life, then that's technically a depressive disorder. I don't know what your views are on that.
Yes, and also sometimes I would tell potential clients that we don't always have to wait for it to meet full criteria anyway. And the good news is either prevention or catching it early. So maybe for billing purposes or insurance purposes, these things matter. But even if you're not meeting full criteria, who doesn't benefit from a little bit of help anyway? So yeah.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And yeah, I'll often tell clients the reason I give a diagnosis is really for insurance purposes. But definitely, like if you can start some kind of treatment or catch this early, it's going to be a lot easier than, waiting years and years and years. And I think if you look at the research, for most, psychological disorders, people take on average like 5 years to seek treatment. So, it can become more like entrenched and ingrained by that point. So I'm definitely with you on that. So in terms of the whole idea of kind of what causes it, in terms of nature and nurture, you can think of nature, biological, genetic, hereditary. Nurture is more environmental, your experiences. Anything psychological tends to be a combination of both of those. But just given that I'm focused on the psychological piece, I'm just going to talk about that part. So in terms of the cognitive behavioral therapy model of depression, this is kind of what we have. So you have some type of stressor. The stressor is anything that can be experienced as stressful or distressing. It can be something that's like in the environment external. So I know so many clients who have had a breakup of a relationship. That can be the stressor. It can also be something internal. Like I had a client who was depressed where he had a back injury, started experiencing consistent chronic pain, and that was the stressor. I've had other people who just the stressor is an emotional state itself. So you have some type of stressor, and it's not necessarily the stressor, but it's the negative view of the stressor. So when you have this stressor, you think of it in a negative light. In CBT, there's something called the negative cognitive triad of depression, where it's negative thoughts about the self, about the world and others and the future. And we specifically try to focus on those kind of thoughts. So for my client with the chronic back pain, he thought of himself as being a broken person. He thought really basically like things aren't fair. And he thought he's never going to get better and his life was never going to be the same. So with that, comes problematic coping responses. So it's when you have the stressor, you view it negatively. And then with that, the coping isn't where it could be. So in terms of coping, the main maladaptive coping or problematic coping, one is isolating from others. So it's like when you start feeling depressed, kind of like that first piece of diagnosis, you don't feel like doing things. So you don't feel like hanging out with people, whether it's friends, family, whoever. You think of it and say, well, it's just not going to be the same. So you start isolating from other people. With that comes overall withdrawal as well. So like just pulling back from life, not doing the things you would normally do, even if they're like social is isolating, non-social withdrawing. And then you have something called ruminating. So ruminating is when you're thinking through basically what the stressor is or kind of problems in your life. Now you're thinking about why it's happening and you're thinking about like how bad it is and the implications in the future for it. So here's just and then with that, that's where you get all these symptoms. And the symptoms are really just what we talked about earlier in diagnosing depression. So here's just an example from one of my current clients. So one of my current clients got let go from his job at the beginning of COVID. From there, he has these different kind of negative views of the stressor. He thought about himself, I'm not good at my job. So basically, I got let go versus some people didn't because of me, when it really turned out he was just junior at his job and all the junior people got let go. But he thought, it's really me, like I'm just not good at what I do. Kind of similar to my chronic back pain client. He thought the world, nothing's fair. With that kind of like nothing's going to work out for me, which goes into the future. I'm never going to find a job as good as this one. So with this negative view of the stressor, how did he cope? One, he started isolating. So he's someone who comes from like a really high achieving family whose focus is on what you do as a career. Like, I'm actually from the Chicago area, and I always say how growing up in Illinois is completely different from being in the Northeast, because Illinois, like when you talk to people, it's more about what do you do for fun? Who do you know? How do you spend your free time? Versus in the Northeast, like whenever I meet people, the first thing they ask is, what do you do for a living? So it's just a very like achievement work oriented culture. So he didn't want to socialize with people because he thought, well, I don't want my friends and family to know about this. I don't want other people to think negatively of me because I'm not working right now. And then his withdrawing from life. So overall, he was just less active. He spent a lot of time laying in bed watching TV. And I think, as I think a lot of therapists have figured out with the whole like streaming services and with cell phones, like people, that's a common depressed activity, just going through episode after episode of whatever TV show. Or, one of my depressed clients is on TikTok all the time, just going video through video because it's kind of a distraction. But in it, you're not engaging in what's important to you. And then in terms of ruminating, he just thinks about how bad his life is now. So look at his life. He's just sitting at home in bed, watching TV, not hanging out with friends and family. he's asking himself why this happened. And again, he thinks it happened because he's just not good at his job. So when he attributes that to himself, he starts thinking about how, well, what's this mean about the future? If I can't do this job and this was just an entry-level position, how am I ever going to make anything about anything of myself? So that's, for this client, how depression started and then developed and has been maintained over time. Anything you want to add to that before we get to the behavioral piece?
I think just a thought that is coming to my mind in terms of the function of ruminating, in that we're really trying to kind of dig ourselves out of the situation, and people are, we're trying to figure out how to move forward. It just so happens that we're running in place. And so sometimes for people to understand you really are trying to help yourself. You're not trying to just beat yourself up. It's just not working. Any thoughts on why people ruminate? Or
Yeah. So it's, rumination happens, and in CBT, we would consider rumination to be a behavior instead of a thought, because it's an active process that, it's technically a choice to engage in. So the reason people ruminate is there's positive and negative beliefs about rumination as a behavior. Positive beliefs are, people think it's helpful in some way. So just exactly what you're talking about. If I can ruminate about my problems, I'm going to find a solution to them. If I ruminate, it's going to help motivate me to really get on top of things and start action. The negative beliefs about rumination are that it's harmful in some way. Typically, the main negative belief that keeps it going is the uncontrollable belief. So you get stuck in your head, you're kind of going over your problems, and especially when your mood's pulled to the kind of depressed, and the stronger the mood is, the harder it seems to disengage from this. So then you get the sense that rumination's uncontrollable. So it starts up because you think it's helpful in some way. So my client might see some kind of, or this happens when he starts his job search. So he'll go on a website looking for a job. Well, they're not going to want me. Then he thinks about why they wouldn't want him and how his life's never going to get better. But then when he gets into that, he thinks, I can't get out of my head. I can't control that. So then that whole process just continues. So in terms of what we can do for treatment, then let's start off with the behavioral side of things. So for the behavioral side, one of the treatments is called behavioral activation. It's actually a treatment in itself, but for most CBT therapists, we'll do this with depressed clients. It's just getting more active and involved in life. So again, with one of the main problematic coping strategies is pulling back, we want clients to move forward. Who benefits it from and who doesn't? So clients who have that typical depression where they're less active, those are clients who benefit from it, versus I get a lot of overachieving depressed clients as well, where they're actually too active because they constantly believe they need to be productive. For that kind of client, I might actually try to pull back on activity or replace certain activities with other activities. So it's really for clients who have that standard lethargic depression and pull back from life. And what does kind of getting active and engaged in life target in terms of that model I just went over? So one, you have the problematic coping. So you have the isolation piece. If you can get people involved in life, because the vast majority of people want to connect with others, and that's what's really important to us, then that's going to give you the potential for some kind of enjoyment or meaning. You have the withdrawal, as I mentioned, which it kind of targets. Then that's kind of what it directly targets, but it also indirectly targets the rumination and negative thoughts. So I think of the client who I just gave the example of, he thinks about his life being horrible now. But one of the reasons he thinks it's horrible is because it's not filled with anything that's important to him. He believes he's just wasting time and wasting space by binge watching TV. So if he can get social, if he can start the job search a little bit more productively, it's going to help with those negative thoughts, because he's going to see his life's not that bad. And he's going to also see that he's capable of doing things that are important to him. With that too, you can indirectly target the rumination because, think about when you're active versus when you're inactive. So when you're really engaged in something, how easy is it to kind of be really internally focused on your head analyzing something versus, let's say, you're just sitting back on the couch doing nothing. So if you can get someone more active and engaged, it's going to make it less likely that they're able to ruminate. And with that reduction in rumination, there's the potential to help with the depression as well. So this is how I describe behavioral activation to clients. I'll say, you had this event that kind of triggered the depression. Between there, again, is more of the negative coping and the negative thoughts, and that leads to your depressed mood. Now, think of when you feel depressed. How's your energy? Energy is low, right? And when you feel depressed and your energy is low, how active do you tend to be? Not very active. So that kind of goes to being less active and isolating. Now, when you feel depressed and you don't believe you have that much energy and then you're less active, what happens to your mood? And some people will say their mood gets worse. Other people say their mood stays the same. I'm just going to kind of write that down. And again, when your mood gets worse, what happens to your energy? And it just spirals. Now, with that, we can't control your mood at will, and we can't control your energy at will, but what we can control is your behavior. So, that's what kind of starts the process off, where clients can see when I feel depressed and I'm less active, that tends to make things worse. So again, how can you potentially make things better being more active? The problem here is, with depression, there's this belief that I need to feel better before becoming active. And again, it's just natural. So let's say if you feel sick, you don't really feel like doing much because in terms of how your body feels, it's not good. Same idea with being, emotionally sick, so to speak. So if you don't feel good mood-wise, you think, well, I should wait to feel better before I do anything. And with depression, like a lot of clients that I've had will say, I don't want other people to be brought down by me. Like other people can see how depressed I feel. But then you have this problem with that depression spiral. And when you are less active, your mood tends to get worse. So what has to happen typically is you have to become active first. And through becoming active first, that can then impact your mood. So it's important for most depressed individuals, but even more with severe depression, because the stronger the depression is, the harder it is to get any distance from your thoughts. So you'll have friends, family, or your therapist tell you things like, well, yeah, but that's, you're exaggerating things. And take a look at what you're thinking. That's not true. But when you feel just absolutely horrible in terms of depression, it's so hard to get distance. Just being active is really what you have to start with. So go for it.
I was just thinking of that great imagery from one of your clients of carrying a backpack full of bricks. And so the more depressed, the more bricks in that backpack, and not impossible to do the behavioral activation, get moving, but it gets harder to move with those bricks. So tolerating that the more depressed you are, maybe movement is harder, but still not impossible. And the lightning that happens as you're doing more. So I really think that's a great analogy.
Thank you. Yeah. And I'll, in a few slides, I'll talk about what you can do also for the thoughts that can get in the way. If I don't, I'm pretty sure I have it in there, but if I don't, remind me. So in terms of how to actually do this behavioral activation, first, take a look at what your typical day is like. So for my client, there was no difference from weekday to weekend because he wasn't working. So it was, okay, when do you wake up? He would tend to wake up at 1, 2 p.m. So he'd sleep in real late. From there, it would basically be, okay, well, he slept in really late. It's time to eat. So then he would go to our local convenience store called Wawa, and he would get a pre-made meal there. But that kind of contributed more to his depression because he would think, well, I'm just wasting money. I'm not even making my own food. From there, he would come home. he might go on his computer to look at for a job or two, but that would usually lead him to think like no one's going to hire me in the first place. So then he would do kind of TV binge watching. And then when it came to be nighttime, he would often switch to video games. So that was his typical day. So get a sense of like, what are you doing day to day? And again, if your weekday is different from your weekend, let's say you're working or at school, kind of figure out what those differences are there too. And when you have what your typical day looks like, you want to ask yourself, what am I doing too much of and too little of? So too much of tends to be the inactivity. So too much time in bed. For my client, too much time on the TV, too much time on video games. I have a 15-year-old client right now who she'll just binge look at TikTok on her phone. And like, that's her way to try to distract herself from her depression. But then she just feels bad and then gets behind at school. And then what are you doing too little of? Overall, it tends to be being social and engaged socially and connecting with people, but also just things that you value. So once you have this idea of, okay, what am I doing too much of and too little of based on my current schedule, now it's time to figure out what to bring into this next week. So you have valued activities, and I'll go over how I do this with clients. You can do enjoyable activities and also activities that lead to a sense of accomplishment. So you can think there's some enjoyable things, like a lot of people enjoy watching movies, but they don't really give you any sense of accomplishment. So after watching a good movie, maybe your mood improves a little bit during it, but you don't really necessarily feel like you've done anything. Versus there can be other things like exercise, where you might absolutely hate exercise, not get any pleasure from it, but you feel good about yourself for having done it. So like in standard CBT, we would say, try to get a balance of these things. The way CBT's been going is more of a focus on value and meaning instead of just solely like enjoyment and sense of accomplishment. So I tend to just focus on values. And when I do this, my colleague and I kind of developed this little worksheet type thing, but it's just getting a sense of there are these different areas of life. So you can have labor, love, and leisure. So labor, you have work and career if you do have a job. And the idea here isn't like your current job, it's just the idea of work in general. You have the idea of education or learning. And again, this isn't like going to school, it's just the idea of learning. And then volunteering, because a lot of people, like I can think of my parents who are retired where, you know, they volunteer, they don't have jobs. For love, there's intimacy, which is romantic relationships. You have friendships, you have family, and we also put spirituality and religion in here. And then leisure, you have recreation, entertainment, and health and fitness. So what I'll do with clients is we'll go down each of these categories and I'll ask, you know, how important is this to you 0 to 10, or how much do you value this 0 to 10? Get a number there and then get a sense of why they value that, why it's important to them. So, you know, in terms of work for this client, this is a lawyer that I was seeing who is depressed. It makes them feel productive and they want to make an impact. You know, what specific activities then can make up the category is having social time with colleagues and doing pro bono work. So like with this too, they're really into learning. So learning, why is learning important to you? Well, it keeps me from getting stuck. It's being an interesting person. I feel like I'm evolving and challenging myself. And then what activities are involved in that? For them, it was reading. They liked autobiographies, historical fiction. They would listen to podcasts and then go to conventions and seminars, as well as traveling. So from doing this with this client, I said, okay, so let's look at what's important to you. And then let's get a sense of how your life looks now. So what they realized is they really just gave up on the learning piece, because they would feel tired after working and then really not want to do much, and then just kind of get sucked into either doing more work because they had a very demanding job, or just kind of zoning out with TV. You know, they're married, and that was what's most important, as well as health. You know, they said it's everything: connection, supporting each other. It's reading together, exploring the city, having date nights, and just conversing with each other. But again, they had pulled back on this kind of activity because they felt tired from the depression and work, as well as health and fitness. health and fitness is part of my mindset, good for mental health and just having a healthy routine. For them, they like tennis, yoga, biking, and exercise. And again, they really pulled back on this. So when I did this with my client, she said, well, I've really given up on learning. I've given up on really doing extra in my relationship, and I've given up on health and fitness. Perfect. So let's schedule this in. So from there, you want to, like in general, again, you want to strike a balance between these kinds of activities. So if a client has like, what they value in terms of recreation, entertainment is like watching movies, I'm not just going to want them to add movies and then that's it. You want to have different kinds of activities. With this though, what I'm going to ask them to do is rate their mood before and after. So part of this is, when you feel depressed, thinking about activities, what do you tell yourself? You tell yourself, I'm not going to enjoy this, right? It's going to not have any impact on anything. So if you can rate your mood before you do one of these things and then rate your mood after, that serves as a little experiment of, does this actually help? So for the most part, you realize that even if your mood, let's say, isn't great, I'll typically say 0 is a horrible mood, 10 is a great mood. Even if it's not, let's say, even above a 5, you might notice that when you started something, you were at a 2 out of 10, and then you change to a 4 out of 10. So that tells you doing these things can make a difference. Again, even if it's not where you'd like it to be. It's really important to rate this immediately after the activity as well, because with depression, let's say right afterwards, you're feeling a little bit better. If you like wait off and for another, let's say, hour to write down how you felt, if your mood's tanked since then, that's going to really kind of distort how you view the activity, and you're just going to view it in that negative light. So I want you to rate immediately afterwards. What this does is, like I said, it sets up as an experiment. Do these things help you feel better, worse, or help you stay, just kind of lead you to stay the same? And that's going to help you figure out what to either continue versus eliminate. So like I was seeing this one professor who had retired and through retirement became depressed because he really saw himself as a professor and that was really important to him. And because he kind of lost that part of his life, he started thinking of things in a negative light. Now with him, you can imagine learning education was extremely important. So I had him start his reading time again. So he used to read a ton, had given it up. He came back in and said, reading was a 0. At the end of reading, it was a 0. What happened is his depression was so intense, he really couldn't concentrate. And he figured, well, when I'm reading, I'm just not understanding what I'm reading. I'm going back and rereading so much. So we had to give that up for now. Okay, so let's put that kind of on the side for now. And let's wait until your mood improves before you can get back to it. But for the most part, people will come back and say, I didn't think I was actually going to enjoy this or get anything out of this, but actually I did. You want to add anything on the behavioral side?
Yeah, I guess just one thought that's coming to mind that I see a lot clinically is clients sometimes who set a goal for behavioral activation of what they're going to work on for the week, and it feels like a pretty, it doesn't feel too extreme, and it feels like something in line with that could be valuable and meaningful to them if they could get themselves to do it. But then in reality, it was much harder than they imagined to try to get themselves to do it. And so, and that's really good information. That's great data and good for them for trying to do it and to assess that. But sometimes there's that beating oneself up that, oh, I can't even read for 10 minutes. So trying to be gentle, like you're saying, see it as really as an experiment to determine like, wow, I had no idea that for me right now, reading became a time just to think about how pathetic my life is. Like that's not maybe the best thing to do. And so it's going to be hard, but trying to not be gentle with yourself as you're assigning yourself these behavioral activation tasks.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's why it can be very helpful to try to start small. So especially if your depression is kind of more severe. So like I had a client the other week who I just started seeing with depression, and She's someone who used to really be into exercise. And I said, okay, based on these values and what's important to you, what do you want to do this next week? And she said, well, I want to get back into exercising every day. Currently, she's not exercising at all. So in my mind, I'm thinking, this is too big of a jump. Like, let's start small. So I said that, it seems like right now you're not doing any exercise. And, I can imagine it might be a big jump to getting back to exercising every day. What do you think about kind of starting smaller? What would that look like? So she went for 2 days in the next week. So yeah, try to start small because, with depression, things are going to be more difficult to accomplish just because that's part of depression and that fatigue. So start small. And with that kind of reminds me of the thought piece too. Watch out for, and we'll talk about thoughts next, but watch out for thoughts getting in the way. So like a big thought that gets in the way is, I don't feel like doing this, and like I don't have the energy to do this. So a typical question I'll ask clients, like let's say it's someone who is working, I'll say, every day you wake up, do you feel like you can and have the energy to work? Most people say, well, no. And with that, does that mean that you don't actually go to work any of those days that you don't feel like going? And pretty much everyone says, well, no, I go. So then I can ask, what's that tell you about this belief that I need to feel like doing something and I need to feel like I have the energy to do it in order to do it? Because, think there's so many things in life that we do that we don't feel like doing. But then when you're depressed and you have that low energy, and then you start telling yourself, what I tend to call permission giving thoughts. So they're thoughts you convince yourself why you don't have to do it. Like, it's not going to make any difference. People are going to like notice that I feel depressed. That leads you to distract. But then again, when you don't put yourself in those situations, there's not the opportunity for any kind of improvement in mood. And that kind of gets into different thoughts that can happen during these activities too. So what a lot of times what happens during is, just like you're talking about, like things aren't going to seem the same as they were before. So with my client who's exercising, she probably isn't going to be able to exercise at the same level. And then what tends to happen is we then compare ourselves negatively to how we used to be. Well, I'm doing this, but I'm not enjoying it as much as I used to. I should be having more fun. This shouldn't seem like it's so difficult. So with that's where one, you have the opportunity to make this as an experiment. So if you're thinking I'm not going to be able to do this or don't have the energy, try it out and see what actually happens. And then during it, what I'll tell clients, especially in terms of their mood state, is let whatever emotion happens happen. Don't try to control it. Don't try to make it any different. So let's say you're going to like a picnic outside with some friends. You tell yourself, well, like I'm rating my mood, I'm at like a 4 out of 10. The minute you tell yourself, I should be like a 7 or 8 out of 10, you're just going to drop to a 1 or a 2. So it goes back to that idea of we can't control our emotional experiences at will. We can just put ourselves in situations that are important to us, and that can lead to improved emotion. But the minute you start telling yourselves you should be doing better or there should be a better experience, that's just going to tank it. So like I'll typically ask clients to, think of the last time you were happy to some extent. Like this could have been years ago for some clients. And during that activity, were you were you having thoughts like, oh, this and this and this is going on, and this is how I'm feeling about this, and this is a situation, and this is what people are doing? Or were you just there experiencing? And pretty much everyone says, no, like I was just focused on the moment. So that's what we can do. We can really just put ourselves in these experiences, focus on the moment, and then whatever emotion shows up, shows up. So speaking of those thoughts, let's get into those now. So in CBT, we talk about something called the cognitive model. The cognitive model is just the idea that it's not the situation we're in or our stressor that causes our reaction. It's how we view it. So automatic thoughts, what are they? They're these quick evaluative thoughts. They generally go unnoticed. We call them automatic because they're outside of our control. So like before I was talking about rumination, where you're actively thinking through something, automatic thoughts just show up on their own. With automatic thoughts, we tend to recognize the emotion. We may not catch what we're thinking. And for depression, they tend to be overly negative, and they're that negativity in terms of ourself, the world, others, and futures that I talked about earlier in terms of the negative cognitive triad. So like I actually had a client, I think it was maybe 3-4 months ago, who had that same situation of losing his job, but his reaction was actually relief, because what he thought about it was, he was really hesitant to leave just because of having stability, and he had a family, and he thought like, great, this will kind of kickstart me to really do what I want to do. Of course, there was some stress there with the whole financial situation, but he felt relief just because he thought of it as an opportunity for him to move into a field that was kind of more aligned with his values, as opposed to my other client who thought, this means I really can't do my job and I'm never going to get hired again. So this is the situation I'll use to describe the cognitive model. It's, you've texted a friend, like family member, partner, it's been 5 hours, you haven't heard back. What's going through your mind? So in terms of this, what could be a thought that leads to depression? It could be that they don't want to hang out with me. It could be they're ignoring me because they don't like me, versus what could be a thought that leads to a more neutral reaction. Let's just say it's like, maybe their phone's off, or they don't have access to their phone right now. Maybe they're busy doing something else. So the idea here is that just like with the situation of my 2 clients both losing their jobs, this is the exact same situation. You text someone, it's been a while, you haven't heard back. But again, the way you think about it is really going to drive that emotional reaction. It's not the situation itself. So in terms of by focusing on thoughts, what do we get in that CBT model? We get at the negative thoughts about the self, world, others, future. It really can be negative thoughts about anything. And we get at the rumination with that, because in the rumination are these individual thoughts. And if you can take a closer look at them, it can cut off that process. So the first step of this is just figuring out what you're thinking in the first place. So basically, it's typically good when you notice like a mood shift. So you find yourself feeling more depressed all of a sudden. Like a time this happens a lot with depression is at night before going to bed. Because again, what happens before you're going to bed? You don't have all those distractions, or you don't have anything to occupy yourself. You're just kind of with yourself, with your thoughts. So a lot of people will say they feel the most depressed when it's nighttime before they go to bed. When you do notice yourself feeling more depressed, it's just asking, what was going through my mind, or what am I thinking? So once you figure out what those thoughts are, there's a few, and these are all, it's a strategy called Socratic questioning. It's taking a look at your thoughts to see if they're accurate or not. So one strategy is something called gathering the evidence, where you really just take a look at what's the evidence for this thought that led to me feeling more depressed versus against it. So this is a college student of mine with kind of joint depression and anxiety. What happened with them is they failed their midterm, and then they thought, I'm going to fail out of college. They came in the next session really distraught because they had been ruminating about this, like how they failed, how much of a failure they were. And then they would worry about failing out of college and what that would mean for like disappointing their parents and their future. So I said, okay, let's take a look at the evidence here. What's the evidence that you are going to fail out of college? Well, I failed my geology midterm. I don't really understand a lot in my classes, and I haven't been going to all my classes. Okay, what about the other side here? Well, I've never failed any classes in my academic career. Teachers have told me I'm smarter than the average student. I have a lot of resources to help. I asked them specifically who that was. Well, my roommate, the student center, I can go to office hours. And I put these in italics just because I took this information here and asked if there was another way to look at it. So in terms of failing the geology midterm, I asked, well, how important is this midterm? They said, well, it's only 15% of my grade, so I can make it up. in terms of understanding, I've been able to understand class material when I've gone to class and completed the readings. So this is someone who kind of with a mixed anxiety and depression, they would cope with avoidance and withdrawal. So they wouldn't go to classes if they felt bad in the morning and they felt depressed in the morning. So then they wouldn't understand because they didn't go to class. And with that, I've gone to some classes and can work on improving my sleeping habits to be more consistent. So that with the depression and anxiety too, their sleep was all over the place. So that kind of impacted that. And then once you have both sides of the equation, I'll just ask what side's stronger. So they said the evidence against was stronger. I personally like to get a sense of how much stronger it is. And they said, I'll say if you had 100 points to break down between the sides, like what would it be? 60, 40, 70, 30, 80, 20, 90, 10. They put theirs at 80, 20. So by doing this, again, think of this client before. So failed this midterm, feel terrible, thinking about how terrible it is, how they're going to fail out of college now, and then have just been stewing in this idea of failing out of college until they got to the session. Instead of taking this as an absolute fact, we looked at the evidence. What's the evidence say for and against that? Through this, they came to this new understanding. Going forward now, they don't have to worry and ruminate about this. You can also just ask for another explanation. So this is really good for interpersonal situations. So thinking about that texting example, I hear this all the time. Like I texted this person, they didn't text me back. I had a depressed high school student I saw the other day where he texted a friend to hang out because it was like the end of the summer. He was leaving his weekend place. And the friend said, oh, like I can't tonight, I got to do family stuff. His interpretation of it was, he doesn't want to be my friend. It's really about me. He's lying to me. Could there be another explanation? Has this person ever lied to you about this kind of stuff? Well, no. So the other explanation is he was just being honest. He really had to do family stuff that night. So you can just ask yourself, and again, this is really good for like social interpretations. Other people are doing something and we're making it out to be something negative, particularly in terms of us as a person. So could there be another explanation for this? Is there another way to interpret this? Or what's another way to look at this? A strategy for future-oriented thoughts is, this is something called decatastrophizing. But when we're thinking about the future, a lot of times we think of these worst case scenarios. So like I can think about my client with the job. So when he was telling himself, I'm never going to find work again, I asked him, so what's the worst thing that could happen? He's like, well, that I wouldn't find work. Now with that, I'm going to ask, what could you do if that did happen? So when we think about these worst case scenarios, a lot of times we stop just at the worst case scenario and we don't think about how we could actively cope with it. So basically he said, well, like if I can't find like work really kind of not indefinitely, but like, for months to potentially years, he said, I can always just move back in with my parents. They're supportive, like they're helpful. They won't take issue with it. So worst case scenario, he could move back in with his parents while he continues to try to find work. He also said, if I can't find a job that's in this field because again, he thought he lost his ideal job, he could always just expand his search criteria to like other kinds of jobs. So that was the worst case. And again, he just got stuck on this idea of never going to find something. He didn't think about, well, what are my options moving forward? From there, it's asking what's the best thing that can happen. So for him, it would be he found a job that's even better than his current job and he finds it immediately. Then what's the most probable? For him, most probably, he said, well, I'll probably find something like someone's going to hire me. It just might not be exactly what I want. Because again, we tend to focus on those worst case scenarios. We don't really think about what's the most likely option, even if the most likely option isn't necessarily exactly what we want it to be. And this is a really easy question that I use all the time. It's just asking, what would I tell a person I trust? So we hold ourselves to double standards a lot. And when we have our own automatic thoughts, because they're our own, like we don't really get distance from them. And especially if you're feeling depressed, thinking about it, that depression's really going to kind of distort how we view it. So you can simply just ask yourself, what would I tell like a trusted person? What would I tell my good friend if they were thinking this in this situation? So like one of my current clients is like a really overachieving student, and she's going into her senior year of college. Already she has set up an internship. She's taking a full course load. She is starting to study for the GREs. And then one of her friends is like an overachiever as well. And the friend is like starting this company. So she came in saying, I'm not doing enough. So she was feeling depressed, thinking that she wasn't doing enough with her life. So what I asked her was, if I told you going into my senior year of college, I was sign up for an internship, I was taking a full course load, I was studying for the GREs, and I told you I'm not doing enough, what would you tell me? She said, well, I tell you, you're already doing too much. You just need to relax. So from there, it's, does this apply to you then? So if we can think about what advice we would give someone else, really try not to hold yourself to that same double standard. Now, for those questioning strategies, those are good if you're not sure if your thought's true or not. But if your thought is true, asking for the evidence for and against it's not going to really be that helpful. So here's a few strategies for if the thought is true. So one is just really question how useful it is for you to keep on repeating this to yourself. So like one of my clients works a full-time job. She's a single mom. She has 3 kids under the age of 5. She does household work like chores, and she just thinks to herself, I hate doing this. So she'll be like cleaning, think, I hate this, and then feel more depressed because she hates doing that. The more she tells herself she hates it, the worse she's going to feel. So what I asked her is, why are you doing this? Why is this important to you? And, she was doing it for her family. So what we came up with was whenever she finds herself telling herself how much she hates it, was just to remind herself, what, I'm doing this for my family. And the idea there isn't to make it a pleasant experience. It's just to take away such kind of a negative emotional connection with it. Another thing is just focusing on problem solving. So with depression, when you pull back and you get stuck in your head, you mentioned that you get kind of stuck in this loop and you don't get out of it. You don't come to a solution. So it's simply just going to problem solving, especially if it's a thought related to a problem, like a client of mine who's having trouble finding work. Simply just ask yourself, what can I do about this? So like I had a client last month where feeling depressed. So she's someone who's retired, living alone, but really thrives on connection. And she's divorced a long time ago, doesn't have any family in the area. Her thought was, I'm lonely. So she was thinking I'm lonely, that she doesn't have anyone in the area that is family, which is true. And then feeling kind of a sense of depression and loneliness. And what I basically told her is, think of that loneliness as signifying connection's important to you. And if connection's important to you, what can you do? So she just used that as motivation to reach out to friends. So what we did with her was, we scheduled like weekly kind of meetings with her friends. So with one of her friends, she scheduled like a weekly dinner. With another friend, she scheduled a weekly lunch. She also joined a few organizations that she would volunteer with, where she could connect with people there. So if there is rumination about a problem, again, instead of getting kind of stuck in the cycle, just simply ask, what can I do about this, develop a plan for it, and then take action. The last thing I'll talk about is you can just figure out if you're making something called a thinking error. This is also called a cognitive distortion. Our thoughts tend to be skewed to certain kind of thinking errors. Like, I'll just go through some examples, like emotional reasoning. So this happens a lot with depression, where you feel a certain way and you think it's true because you feel it so strongly. Like my client who lost his job, he felt like a failure and he felt really depressed thinking about that. So because I feel like a failure, it must be that I truly am a failure. just like that idea of thinking about the worst, that's something called catastrophizing. So you're making these negative predictions about the future without considering less problematic outcomes. A mental filter is you only pay attention to negative details instead of seeing the whole picture. So like I had one of my depressed clients right now, they had like a Zoom get together with friends and it went really well. But like they made a joke and they saw on like the little screen and like one person wasn't laughing. So throughout the entire kind of Zoom get together was a great time. They enjoyed themselves, but they just focused on that one person who didn't seem to laugh at their joke. You also have mind reading, which is really common, where you just believe you know what other people are saying. So the idea here is, you get stuck in your head, your thoughts tend to be skewed towards the negative, but the problem isn't that first thought that shows up, it's that's followed by more and more negative analysis or rumination about it. So the idea here is you can take a look at that thought through those questioning strategies I went over, or you can just ask yourself, am I making a thinking error? Because it serves that same kind of purpose. Oh, well, I'm just catastrophizing. Because what we're looking to do is we're just looking to cut off that process. Because thinking about the cognitive side of things, we feel a certain way because emotions are useful. They give us communication, they give us motivation. So with emotions, they should be proportionate to the situation. So if you're sitting down with a friend watching a movie, if you enjoy movies and enjoy connecting with friends, your mood should be pretty positive or maybe closer to neutral, let's say. Now, what happens with depression is you're not focused on the movie, you're focused on having a conversation with your friend. You're focused internally analyzing something that's skewed towards the negative. So thinking, well, they don't really want to be here with me. Like they're just doing this out of pity. Like this movie isn't as good as I thought it would be. So all we're trying to do with the cognitive piece is we're just trying to cut off that rumination to get more experience in life. What I'll tell clients is, we can't control emotions. I always say if we could control emotions at will, I'd be out of a job. What we can control is we control where we focus our attention. We control the meaning we give to experiences, and we control our behavior. So all we can do is put ourselves in situations that we value. When we're in those situations, we can be fully engaged and focused on what we're doing, and then we can let whatever emotion shows up to show up. Typically, happiness or enjoyment shows up when we're fully engaged in something we value. So again, there's the behavioral activation piece, getting involved, and the thought piece, we're really just trying to get out of our heads and not let thoughts interfere either with us starting this, continuing it, or after when we're having like a negative view on what happened. I think that's all I got, except just we have to kind of promote the organization beckinstitute.org, where we have resources. We developed a whole like COVID-19 resource. There's CBT worksheets there. There's blogs, articles. It's for therapists and clients.
How wonderful. And I'm thinking there was so much information packed in that maybe this will be a part 1, because we would love to find a time to maybe have you back for a part 2. And so for all those out there that are watching, as we said in the beginning, feel free to email in questions, and we're happy to get them to Dr. Hyman. And maybe at some point we could even have him back to share even additional tips. And just the funny thing about CBT, CBT for anxiety, CBT for depression, it makes so much sense. It always feels like, okay, this is easy enough. And then there are moments where it just also feels like the most complex thing in the world, and the hardest thing to do, back to the moving brick. So for anyone who's watching it, on one hand, it is simple. On the other hand, it's the hardest thing in the world to create change in your life. So the fact that you're watching right now is an amazing first step, and building upon this in small, meaningful ways, like Dr. Hyman discussed, is how you're going to make progress. So thank you so much for joining us today and providing in such clear, you communicate in such clear, helpful terms that it's really helpful whether you're a practitioner or a mental health consumer to hear this and remind ourselves of the path to work past depression. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, and that's my meter. All right. Thank you so much.